All right, here we are. We're here with Literature Survey Part 4. This one has to do with medieval Latin, specifically early medieval Latin, from the 6th basically through the 9th century. This will probably be a quick one. Next installment will be about Welsh stuff, especially King Arthur. So you may not want to miss that one. So, first, what happened in the early Middle Ages? It's a little vague sometimes when exactly the Middle Ages stopped and when they started. When in this does it start? Does it end with the fall of Constantinople? Does it end with the discovery of America? Does it end with the Reformation? In terms of the beginning, did the Middle Ages really begin precisely at the fall of Rome, or does it take a while because at first, people, when Rome fell, the civilization was still late antiquity. Then gradually what happens in the West is that remember that the Roman Empire survived in the East for at the very least, another couple of centuries. At the very least, it depends on how you count it, but at least a century and a half, possibly as much as 1,000 years, depending on how you count it. And when you count the fall, or do you count the fall or do you go until 1204 and the Fourth Crusade? When do you it gets, we don't need to get into all that stuff. So what happens is the Roman state doesn't exist anymore. The Roman Empire, the state, does not exist anymore in the West. So, and I mentioned this last time too, so the bureaucracy gets a lot simpler. And a large part of the purpose of the education had been to prepare people for the bureaucracy, to join the bureaucracy, to be part of the bureaucracy. So once that's gone, the need for laity to receive a classical education becomes a lot less. Now, we can contrast here Byzantium, because in Byzantium, in the East, you've still got the laity and the bureaucracy. Oh, hello there. Hello, space chap. You've still got the bureaucracy in the East, and therefore you've still got an educated laity. In the West, the educational system is still primarily becomes limited to the clergy, largely limited to the clergy, not entirely, but largely limited to the clergy. Oh, let me do this. There. Hello there. So there are a few. We may need to clarify a few things about the Middle Ages because most people are quite ignorant on the subject and don't know as much about the Middle Ages as they think they do. They think it's an unrelieved period of gloom and misery, and then suddenly in the Renaissance, yay, yay, yay. Not at all. Not at all. In the things that were bad in the Middle Ages, violence and stuff, are mostly just as bad in other periods of history. They've been bad pretty much throughout history. Even specifically bad medieval things like persecution of heretics and stuff is worse in the Renaissance. And I've got a nice little, you know what I need to do? I need to share my screen. Half a second, let me do that. Share screen. Application window. Okay, there we go. So a few medieval inventions include eyeglasses. That's from the 13th century. So if I can see my computer screen, it's largely thanks to some friar in the Middle Ages. Clocks, universities, parliament, trial by jury, printing, tail end of the Middle Ages, water mills. I think water mills were invented in the Middle East, but I'm not sure. Compass, China, astrolabe, apparently from Moorish Spain, hourglasses, and for some reason I've got whiskey on this list, even though I don't drink whiskey. So that's a short list. And there's a nice little page on Wikipedia, medieval European scientists. The one everyone's heard of is Roger Bacon. So, lecture number 4, Latin in the Dark Ages. And as I mentioned, next lecture we get to do a lot of King Arthur stuff. Not so much this time, but there'll be some of that. So we have to start with the writer who was from this period who was most popular in the Middle Ages. Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy. This work is not so terribly popular now. Probably most people haven't even heard of it. But in the Middle Ages, it was a bestseller for about 1,000 years after it was written. It was written in the 6th century, I think like 524 or something like that. Not sure the precise date, but for some reason, actually I think 524 might be the year Boethius died. I've got the year in my head for some reason. Okay, now I've got my notes. I can answer that question. The Consolation of Philosophy was written in 523 during the imprisonment of Boethius. He was awaiting trial and execution for the alleged crime of treason under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. Now, Theodoric had conquered Italy actually after the fall of Rome. He conquered most of Italy. Then, of course, he became, like a lot of these barbarian rulers, he became like the heir to Roman civilization and would put on Roman airs, so to speak. So, on being imprisoned, he got depressed, and then he wrote this, text, which reflects, I'm quoting from Wikipedia here, which reflects on how evil can exist in a world governed by God, and how happiness is still attainable amidst fickle fortune. And things like free will and stuff come into it too. So, this work, incidentally, was translated by Alfred the Great and by Chaucer. So, here's a little excerpt from it. Who wrought my studious numbers smoothly once in happier days, now perforce in tears and sadness, learn a mournful strain to raise, lo the muses, grief dishevelled, daub my pen and voice my woe. Down their cheeks unfeigned the tears drop, to my sad complainings flow. And so basically he was depressed for a while, and then philosophy turns up. There appeared above my head a woman of countenance exceeding venerable. Her eyes were bright as fire, and of more than human keenness. Her complexion was lively, her vigor showed no trace of enfeeblement, and yet her years were right full, and she plainly seemed not of our age and time, and so forth. So, and she comes back, and she comes to console him. Could I desert thee, child, said she, and not lighten the burden which thou hast taken upon thee through the hatred of thy name by sharing this trouble? And then she goes on to console him in various ways. And then at the end, I think she affirms the providence and free will. But thou wilt say, if it is in my power to change my purpose, I shall make void providence, since I shall perchance change something which comes into its foreknowledge. My answer is, thou canst indeed turn aside thy purpose, but since the truth of providence is ever at hand to see that thou canst, and whither thou dost, and whither thou turnest thyself, thou canst not avoid the divine foreknowledge, even as thou canst not escape the sight of a present spectator, although of thy free will thou turn thyself to various actions. And so forth. So here's a tiny bit of that. Here's a tiny bit of the Latin, and then I'll move on. Carmina qui quondam studio florente peregi, flebilis heo mestos cogor inire modos. Ecce mihi lacere dictant scribenda camene, et veris elegi fletibus ora rigant. And so forth. So that's enough of that. So now I'm going to mention a few others. Saint Gildas. I need to mention him at one point because there's a possible reference to King Arthur. Basically, he tells the story of how the Anglo-Saxons invaded England and of the British resistance. First under Ambrosius Aurelianus, and then under an unnamed leader who wins them to victory at Mount Badon. And thereafter there's like maybe some 30 years of relative peace where the Britons are doing relatively well. Then he dies, and then things start going downhill again from the point of view of the native Britons. So one theory is that this chieftain who won the victory at Mount Badon around the year 500 may have been Arthur. It's explicitly stated in Nennius' History of the Britons in the 9th century. It's explicitly stated that the victor was Arthur. But that's 9th century. That's like 300 years later. So let me give you just a little bit of Gildas. So basically what happened was the Picts and the Scots were attacking. The British revolted, and eventually they may or may not, this I'm quoting from Peter Heather. The book is entitled Empires and Barbarians, and it's basically the history of the period from the fall of Rome to about the year to the 11th century. So they were having trouble with the invasion of Scots and Picts. So what were they to do? The Britons, and I'm quoting from Gildas, convened a council to decide the best and soundest way to counter the brutal and repeated invasions and plunderings. Then all the members of the council, together with the proud tyrant, were struck blind. The guard they devised for our land was the ferocious Saxons. A pack of cubs burst forth from the lair of the barbarian lioness, coming in 3 keels, as they call warships in their language. On the orders of the tyrant, they first of all fixed their dreadful claws on the east side of the island, ostensibly to fight for our country, in fact to fight against it. The mother lioness learnt that their first contingent had prospered, and she sent a second and larger troop of satellite dogs. Eventually the Saxons complained that their monthly allowance was insufficient, and swore that they would break their agreement and plunder the whole island, unless more lavish payment were heaped upon them. There was no delay. They put their threats into immediate effect. A fire leapt up and, nurtured by the hand of the impious Easterner, spread from sea to sea. It devastated town and country round about, and once it was alight, it did not die down until it had burnt almost the entire surface of the island and was licking the western ocean with its fierce red tongue. So that's the Saxon invasion, and as I said, Aurelius Ambrosius, that's the name that's given here, organized a counterattack which culminated in a victory at Baden Hill, wherever that may be. And Peter Heather says that Aurelius Ambrosius is an historical prototype of the mythical Arthur, but there have been lots and lots of theories about that. Maybe that's the most recent one, I don't know. Can I make the presentation full screen? No, but I can do, there's one thing I can do that will help. That might help. I can do this. How's that? Want me to turn the music down? Half a second. Sorry, I'm just seeing the chat now. The medieval Dark Age is kind of propaganda. It started as kind of a propaganda that stuck successfully over the centuries. Like the whole flat Earth thing. Everyone believes that the church taught the Earth was flat. That's absolute rot. But people insist on believing it, even though it's very easy to do a Google search and find out the answer. But is this a little bit better? Hopefully this is a little bit better. In terms of the music and the presentation, if I do it full screen, I can't toggle, and that makes it awkward. Was Alfred really called Alfred? He was called something like Alfred, which means elf council. So pretty close to Alfred. Alfred. Let's see. So that's Gildas. Okay. Okay, let me quickly mention a few other people here. Saint Benedict, rule of Saint Benedict, founder kind of Western monasticism, although there were monks before then. I mean, Saint Augustine, was he in there were definitely monasteries in the West before Saint Benedict, but his rule became kind of codified Western monasticism for several centuries. Saint Gregory the Great, Pope, famous for the line, "Non angeli sed angli," not angels but English, which is cited in Bede's, well, what do you call it? Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people. For some reason, Bede's not listed here. Or is he? Okay, he is. Good. But he also wrote lots of commentaries on scripture. Saint Gregory of Tours, History of the Franks, all the goings on in Merovingian France. A lot of it quite, what's the word I'm looking for? Quite, some of it rather lurid. Fratricide, there may have been some incest going on. It got very messy. But anyway, he wrote that down. Isidore of Seville. Half a moment. He wrote the Isidore of Seville, the etymologies, basically an encyclopedia. Basically an encyclopedia. I think that's on, let's see. I'm checking here. Okay. Okay. It supplies a whole system of education, including both Christian and secular material. He lays out in a whole range of studies in which the 7 liberal arts would precede divine studies. So the first 3 books cover a curriculum that's useful for all the clergy, whereas the remaining 17 add miscellaneous information more useful to certain professions, and so forth. So that's St. Isidore of Seville. Have a moment, I need to check. I just got a notification. All right, nothing, never mind. Yeah, sorry, forgot to highlight that one. Okay, so that's those people. A bunch of Ireland, learning prospered in Ireland during this period. 6th, 7th centuries through the 9th century. There's a philosopher named John Scotus Eriugin in the middle of the 9th century. I used to know something about him, but I've forgotten it. St. Brendan, I mentioned him because he's known for that story of the journey that may or may not refer to traveling to America. St. Columba, the missionary to Scotland, to the Scots specifically. The Scotland at that time had Scots and Picts, and also the British were still there in Strathclyde. So there were it wasn't unified until the 9th century. Saint Columbanus, who was on the continent. involved in controversy over things like the date of Easter and stuff like that. There were controversies, but when was the date of Easter? There were certain customs that had developed in the British Isles and also in Brittany that didn't follow precisely those current in Rome. However, that was also true in other places like Spain, for example. Spain had its own liturgy. Adamnan, the author of the life of Saint Columba, I think he was 9th century, maybe 8th. Actually, I should probably check that before I say. And Virgil, I believe he's the one that said other inhabited worlds exist. Let me just quickly check Adamnan states. Adamnan was the end of the 7th and beginning of the 8th centuries. That's when he lived. And okay, Saint Boniface, the Saint Boniface was the missionary to Germany. Venerable Bede, Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Oh wait, before I go to Bede, before I go to the Venerable Bede, let me quote a tiny bit from a poem attributed to Saint Columba. Saint Columba, 521 to 597. Regis regum rectissimi, propias dies Domine, dies ire et vindicte, tenebrarum et nebulae, dies mirabilium, tonitruorum fortium, dies quoque angustiae, memoris ac Christiae, and so forth. Of the most righteous King of Kings, near at hand is the day of the Lord, the day of wrath and vengeance, day of darkness and mist, day of marvelous thunder and mighty thunderclaps, day also of anguish, of grief and sorrow, etc., etc. So, kind of a downer. So, the Venerable Bede, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, our chief source for like the 7th century history of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Also, to some extent, oh, pardon me a moment. Hello? Just a moment. Pardon me half a moment. I need to get that. That might be my groceries. sorry about that. I had to get those groceries, and I had to put the frozen ones away. I couldn't, so I had no choice. Sorry about that. I think the driver came a bit early. He was meant to come. He shouldn't have come for another quarter hour, but that's all right. I was talking about Bede and the ecclesiastical history of the English people, principal source of history for that period. And actually, this bit here isn't from the ecclesiastical history of the English people is best known for the bit I mentioned earlier about St. Gregory the Great, non angeli sed angli, and St. Augustine of Canterbury and his 40 monks. A completely different St. Augustine from St. Augustine of Hippo. Not the same person at all. This little bit here is from the life of St. Cuthbert. But Cuthbert, having gone out from the library with a spy following, went down to the sea, whose shores, above the shores of which the monastery itself was built. Having gone into the deepest parts, having gone into the depths of the sea up to his neck and arms, the wave surged, swelling, and he passed the watchful darkness of night with praises of the sound of the sea. Sorry, this is a little awkward to translate. But when dawn approached, he went back up onto land again, and he began to pray. And while he was praying, there came straightway from the depth of the sea 2 4-footed animals, which are commonly called otters. These, now it would be nice if Latin observed the normal order of words, but it doesn't. These began with their breath to warm his feet, and were trying to dry it with their fur. Having completed this service, they received from him a blessing and returned under their native waves. This is the kind of thing that happened a lot, apparently, in the Dark Ages. They were always befriending animals and birds and things. Now, this is going to be a short one, but this is going to be a relatively brief one, but before I close, I need to say something about the Carolingian Renaissance. So, pardon me a moment, I'm getting my books. The Carolingian Renaissance was a cultural revival in Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries. Now, whether it's really Renaissance is another question, Well, a large part of the By now, the Anglo-Saxons had been converted. The missionaries were on the continent. They founded schools of history. They founded a school where classical works were copied, and there were also Spanish churchmen involved. The main figure, or the most well-known figure, was Alcuin. Well, I don't know if he's actually canonized. So I don't know if he's actually been canonized. Alcuin, who settled at Charlemagne's court and established a court academy at the capital. Writers, poets, and historians gathered there, creating a cultural center where Latin classical tradition was revived. And they even gave themselves classical names. Although some of them also have biblical names, like Charlemagne was known as David. They were trying to improve the Latin of their age and copy the style of classical writers. Founded schools. And a major achievement of the Carolingian Renaissance was introducing a new calligraphy called the Carolingian script. It says here Gothic. I'm pretty sure Gothic is 12th century. So that's what I learned in Latin paleography class. So the script, the Carolingian script, eventually became our modern minuscule. So that's where we get our lowercase letters from. They come directly from the Carolingian period. So have a moment. Alcuin, for example, Alcuin wrote a dialogue. Now it's being claimed, by the way, that no medieval dialogues existed. That's clearly not the case. Alcuin wrote at least this one, and I believe others too, about the art of rhetoric. A disputation or discussion, maybe, of rhetoric and of the virtues around the end of the 8th century. And it has Alcuin and Charlemagne, where the king is the student. He asks questions, and Alcuin answers all his questions. So Charlemagne asks for basic definitions of terms. Alcuin will list the components of a law case before explaining this or that doctrine, and so forth. So another important figure I need to mention before I close is Einhart, the author of The Life of Charlemagne. And he was actually, he apparently wrote The Life of Charlemagne sometime around 830 AD-ish. Around that time, he's writing a public history of Charlemagne, describing his life and his habits, and remaining succinct. He's the one who gives us the detail that Charlemagne could read, but he could never figure out how to write. Also, Einhardt's Life of Charlemagne contains the first reference to Roland, which eventually becomes which eventually leads to the Song of Roland in medieval French and a whole bunch of other works in French and Italian and other works. Now, in Song of Roland, it's stated that the chief enemy is the Moors, and those are the ones that killed Roland in the Song of Roland. But in actual fact, it was the Basques. And here's Einhart. We'll just give a brief passage in English. At a time when this war against the Saxons was being waged constantly and hardly an intermission at all, Charlemagne left garrisons at strategic points all along the frontier, and went off himself with the largest force he could muster to invade Spain. He marched over a pass across the Pyrenees, received the surrender of every single town and castle which he attacked, and then came back with his army safe and sound, except for the fact that for a brief moment on the return journey, while he was in the Pyrenean mountain range itself, he was given a taste of Basque treachery. Dense forests, which stretch in all directions, make this spot most suitable for setting ambushes. At a moment when Charlemagne's army was stretched out in long columns of march, as the nature of the local defiles forced it to be, these Basques, who had set their ambush on the very top of one of these mountains, came rushing down on the last part of the baggage train, and the troops who were marching in support of the rear guard and so protecting the army which had gone on ahead. The Basques forced them down into the valley beneath, joined battle with them, and killed them to the last man. They then snatched up the baggage, and protected as they were by the cover of darkness, which was just beginning to fall, scattered in all directions without losing a moment. In this feat, the Basques were helped by the lightness of their arms and by the nature of the terrain in which the battle was fought. On the other hand, the heavy nature of their own equipment and the unevenness of the ground completely hampered the Franks in their resistance to the Basques. In this battle died Einhard, who was in charge of the king's table, Anshelm, the count of the palace, and Roland, lord of the Breton marches, along with a great number of others. What is more, this assault could not be avenged there and then, for once it was over, the enemy dispersed in such a way that no one knew where or among which people they could be found. So, fun fact, Roland may be one of my ancestors. I would have to check the family tree. He might be one of my ancestors. I'm not sure. So, okay. Half a moment. Okay, that's all right. I'm going to call it good, as they say here. We're going to sign off here, but our next one will be about Welsh literature of the Middle Ages, and especially lots of stuff about King Arthur and related matters. So you won't want to miss that one. That one's going to be a lot of. I think that will be a lot of fun and will be quite interesting. So, and I don't know yet what the date is because I want to make sure that more people can attend it. This was just kind of a quickie. That one will hopefully, it might take longer, and hopefully we'll get some interest because King Arthur. Okay, so on that note, I will see you later. Have a riot.